First impressions are everything. At a job, at a first date, even on your F1 debut, which is probably under more scrutiny than the glare of your potential new manager or the wide-eyed surprise of a prospective partner who didn't realise that a human could eat that much cheese. On your F1 debut, you have the eyes of the world on you, and you want to leave the best first impression you can. So, how do you do that? Scoring points is a welcome return. Immediately breaking your point stack on your debut is both a relief, neatly circumventing a George Russell-esque wait for those first points, but also a statement of an immediate competitiveness. Of the 771 drivers to have started an F1 Grand Prix, 78 have scored a point on their debut, most recently Nick de Vries, meaning only 10% of drivers have ever achieved that milestone. Some, like Lewis Hamilton or Jacques Villeneuve, have announced their World Championship potential with a podium. Only 23 drivers have claimed this accolade, the last of which was Kevin Magnussen in 2014. And I would be remiss not to mention Giancarlo Baghetti, winner of the 1961 French Grand Prix, and to date, the only driver to win on his F1 debut, if we neatly avoid the first ever Grand Prix, the 1950 British Grand Prix, where it would have been exceedingly difficult for a driver not to win on their F1 debut, since it was everyone's F1 debut. And if we skirt around the inclusion of the Indy 500 into the F1 World Championship between 1950 and 1960, which most historians tend to do. So if we omit those statistics from the 1950 British Grand Prix and those Indy 500 races, we are left with quite a small list of those who have achieved another remarkable statistic, to have led a lap on their F1 debut, of which only 5 drivers have ever done so, or 0.006% of every F1 driver ever. 3 of those I've already mentioned, Messrs Baghetti, Villeneuve and Hamilton. We also have Carl Kling, who was part of the dominant Mercedes Grand Prix squad in 1954 and 55, and one other, a Markus Winkelhock, who boasts a statistically remarkable F1 career. For whilst the other 4 were in race-winning championship-challenging machinery, Winkelhock was sat in comfortably the slowest car on the grid, having qualified in last place. And then, having achieved such a remarkable feat to join such an exclusive club, we never saw or heard from Winkelhock in the F1 paddock ever again. So today, let's unravel the hows and the whys of Markus Winkelhock and his Nürburgring shock. Before we dive into Markus's story, it's worth reflecting on the name Winkelhock and the legacy that comes with it. It might not be a racing name that carries as much prestige or recognition from the casual observer as perhaps Schumacher or Andretti, but the family Winkelhock is a family with a strong motorsport pedigree, though perhaps more of a checkered one than those previously mentioned examples. Markus's father Manfred was the first. A quick glance at his career wouldn't be much to pay attention to, a sole 5th place from 47 Grand Prix, racing for 80s also-rans like ATS or RAM. But to do so would do a disservice to how adored Manfred was by the German fans. For Manfred's racing exploits came at a time when Germany was a dormant power in racing circles. This was a Germany pre-Rosberg, Vettel and Schumacher. When Manfred first arrived in F1 in 1980, only 2 Germans had won an F1 race, for a grand total of 3 wins, which is mildly dwarfed by the 179 they currently possess. But all who watched Manfred loved his gung-ho approach to driving, from the adoring fans to the friends who required a change of underwear each time they were passengers in the same car as him. All Manfred cared about was being sat in a car and driving it quickly. That he did so in all manner of vehicles, not just F1, but touring cars, sports cars, you name it, Manfred was driving it, notably winning the 1,000 kilometres of Monza race in 1985. But in the summer of that year, at a World Sports Car Championship race at Canada's Mosport Park circuit, Manfred crashed his Porsche 962C at the notorious Clayton Curve, hitting the long concrete barrier on the outside of the corner. He suffered severe injuries to both his head and legs, and Manfred succumbed to his injuries the very next day. Markus was only 5. Understandably, Manfred's death pumped the brakes on the racing aspirations of brother Joachim, who'd been racing in German Formula Ford at the time and only competed in some sporadic touring car outings across the next few years. But by 1987, Joachim was back in single-seaters, now in German Formula 3. Runner-up that year, he was champion the next at the tender age of 28. Smokin' Joe, as he was known, wanted to go to Formula 3000 for 1989, but sponsors Camel Germany insisted on a jump up the ladder into F1. And his brief tenure there left no doubt that it was his cigarette addiction that prompted his nickname, because he certainly wasn't smoking his rivals. Signed to AGS, he had the misfortune of being signed to the team's second car, which, in those days, meant navigating the dreaded Friday pre-qualifying sessions just to make it into Saturday qualifying. In a cash-strapped backmarker car, Joachim had little chance to shine, and he failed to ever make it to Saturday, being as close as 2.3 seconds from making the cut at Imola, but slowest of all on 2 other occasions. Sick of only being used for attracting sponsors and as a sacrificial lamb on Friday mornings, Joachim quit after 9 races. An F1 hero he might not have been, but Joachim is still known to this day as a touring car legend. British champion in 93, Asia Pacific champion in 94, German champion in 95, and a Le Mans winner in 99 to boot. Their brother Thomas also dabbled in racing, taking a Formula Koenig title in 1989, following in the footsteps of a certain Michael Schumacher the previous year, and was a German touring car champion in 98, and continued to race on in touring series across Germany and Europe. That brings us neatly on to Markus. With his father and both his uncles having felt the call of the racetrack, it was little surprise that Markus would want to do the same, though with a less than conventional career path. It wasn't until 1998, when Markus was 17, that he started racing, neatly circumventing karting and jumping straight into car racing. Markus admitted it was just for fun, but when he finished runner-up in Formula Koenig that year, he realised he had a touch of the old Winkelhock magic about him and set about forging a racing career. He quickly climbed the junior categories, winning races every step of the way. In 1999, he ranked inside the top 6 in both European and German Formula Renault. 2000 saw another top 6 ranking, this time in the Formula Renault Euro Cup, where he'd tangle with the likes of future F1 legends Felipe Massa and Kimi Räikkönen, the latter of which was a year away from his F1 debut. It wouldn't be the last time Markus would go wheel to wheel with the Finn. He remained comfortably in the leading pack when he stepped up to German Formula 3 for 2001 and 2002. Never quite fast enough to challenge for the title, but quick enough to be taking wins and podiums, he peaked in 2003 when the series merged with French Formula 3 to become the Formula 3 Euro Series, and 2 wins placed him 4th, ahead of the likes of Nico Rosberg and Robert Kubica. At the end of 2001, a minor German racing company called Mercedes came a-knockin', and Markus was signed up as a Mercedes junior that would cover his time in F3 and a season in the DTM for 2004, with an end goal of making it into F1. But that all fell apart like a Toro Rosso car at the 2010 Chinese Grand Prix. Markus's 2004 DTM season was entirely pointless, failing to finish higher than 13th. Mercedes said Auf Wiedersehen at the end of that year, and so Markus slunk back to the world of single-seaters for 2005, for what would be a decidedly mixed year in the World Series by Renault. 3 wins left him 3rd overall behind champion Kubica, but only 2 points behind runner-up Adrian Valles, and ranking ahead of the likes of future IndyCar champions Will Power and Simon Pagenaud, plus all-around racing legend Pastor Maldonado. But it was a far from perfect year, most notably at the Monaco round, where he crashed at Saint-Devote after going fastest of all in qualifying, and then promptly went and did the same thing on race day. No longer part of the Mercedes or in fact any junior driver program, it was up to Markus to wedge his foot into the proverbial F1 door. And that he did by getting in touch with Colin Colles, managing director for Midland F1, whom Markus had met during his time in German Formula 3. A test was arranged at Jerez in December, and Winkelhock immediately impressed. Colles noted how at home he looked in the car, and by the end of January, he was confirmed as a test and reserve driver for Midland, with several Friday practice appearances lined up. Midland, seemingly determined to pay homage to McLaren in 2023 and stuff as many drivers into one car as possible, signed a plethora of names to their test program. Alongside Winkelhock, there was German Adrian Sutil and Swiss Giorgio Mondini, whilst Frenchman Alexandre Premat and Venezuelan EJ Viso also popped up later on in the year, all of whom would receive some Friday running. These free practice appearances were at a time when teams outside the top 4 in the previous year's Constructors' Championship could run a third car during free practice, and typically these cars would run with lighter fuel loads to assess the car's one-lap potential. And thus it wasn't a surprise to see the likes of Anthony Davidson's Honda or Alexander Wurtz's Williams topping the timesheets in 2006, ahead of the more established top runners like Fernando Alonso's Renault or Michael Schumacher's Ferrari. So judging Markus's times and session positions would be a largely irrelevant judgment of his performances, in much the same way it might be a push to proclaim Anthony Davidson a better driver than Michael Schumacher because he kept beating him in free practices that year. So it seems perhaps the fairest judgment we can make on those 5 practice appearances is to compare him alongside his fellow third drivers. It would be fair to say he matched expectations. Out of all the third drivers participating that year, in each session he participated, Markus was generally slowest of them all, bar the Super Aguris and occasionally the Toro Rossos. And that matched with the on-track performance of the Midland team, who, on average, were the 10th fastest car of the 11 teams that year. And it matched the performances of his fellow Midland testers too, all of whom were delivering similar results, though Sutil was arguably dragging the Spyker kicking and screaming a little higher than perhaps regulars Markus or Mondini could muster. 2007 rolled around and there was a very different look to the Midland outfit. Not only were the cars liveried in their most violently orange colour scheme since Donald Trump, but the name Midland had been hastily Tipexed out above the garage as new owners Dutch sports car maker Spyker took over the team. Perhaps unsurprisingly, they retained the services of fellow Dutchman Christian Albers for a second year with the team, but Portuguese Tiago Monteiro had been dropped. Slotting into his seat was Winkelhock's fellow 2006 tester Adrian Sutil, off the back of a title-winning campaign in Japanese Formula 3. Markus was retained as a test and reserve driver alongside a brand new cast and crew of Adrian Valles, Fairuz Fauzi and Guido van der Gaard. But with new rules in place now banning the running of third cars at Grand Prix weekends, there would be no planned free practice running for Markus that year. Instead, he toddled back to the DTM for a few races, first substituting for an injured Tom Christensen after the Dane had been part of a massive crash at the season opener at Hockenheim, and then Adam Carroll when the Brit sponsorship money ran dry. But just like his last sojourn in the world of touring cars, it was an unsuccessful return for Markus, and he scored no points. It was scarcely much better for Spyker. New owners they might have had, but money they did not, and a budget tighter than wasn't helping produce the best car they could. Chief Technology Officer and F1 veteran Mike Gascoigne was quick to highlight that the car had, like my Netflix viewing history, far too much drag, which wasn't helped by an inability to do any wind tunnel testing until the middle of September, 3 months later than they'd planned. On top of that, there were ongoing issues with their new Ferrari engine, with the Spyker notably struggling with straight-line speed, as well as their fuel consumption. What also didn't help matters was just how competitive F1 was in 2007. On average, the Spykers were 3 seconds or less from pole, which, had that been the case the previous year or even within the last few years, would have seen them around the lower to middling midfield and in the hunt for some points. But in 2007, so condensed was the field that a 3-second gap like that left them half a second adrift at the back. And that wasn't helped by their nearest rivals Toro Rosso and Super Aguri, using reworked year-old chassis from parent teams Red Bull and Honda that year too. Racing at the back of the grid and with only their teammate to realistically battle against, it was a tale of contrasting fortunes for both Sutil and Albers' exploits in 2007. Though a rookie, Sutil had impressed. He'd made mistakes, as any rookie is anticipated to, but he'd impressed the team as he'd learned and developed, and others had noted that despite driving the slowest car on the grid, he was not only dominating his teammate and qualifying in races, but frequently challenging other drivers in vastly superior equipment. At the end of the year, when a seat had become vacant at championship leaders McLaren, Sutil's name was even mooted for that drive. On the other end of that scale, though, was Albers. Entering his 3rd year, he'd matched or beaten all of his previous teammates, Patrick Friesacker and Robert Dornbos at Minardi, and Monteiro the previous year. But Christian seemingly had no answer for the pace of his new rookie rival. Gascoigne put it down to a mental issue, that Albers' emotional fragility meant he could be quick on Fridays, but when the pressure was on for qualifying and the race, he just couldn't deliver. And the combination of pressures from himself, Sutil, the team, the Dutch press and his own sponsors would very quickly snowball out of control for Christian. At the French Grand Prix, the 8th round of the season, Albers exited the pits but ignored all signals telling him to do so, for his fuel rig was still attached. And so Christian trundled all the way down the pit lane with a bizarre sight of a giant silver hose dangling off the back of his car. He immediately pulled over to retire from the race, and was rewarded with a €5,000 penalty for dangerous driving. Just 9 days later came the wholly unsurprising news that Albers had been dropped by the team. The team insisted this was owing to a sponsor default on payments, and director Michel Moll was quoted as saying this was one of the hardest decisions he'd ever made, which does make one query what kind of a hard life he might have endured up to this point. Whatever the case, there was now a vacant slot on the F1 grid, and no shortage of names being linked to it. Williams tester and former Jordan racer Narain Carter-Kayan was one of the first suggested, and was supposedly even contacted about taking on the drive. Then Renault's test driver Nelson Piquet was proposed, with some sources suggesting that Renault boss Flavio Briatore wanted the Brazilian to gain some racing experience before moving up to race for Renault the next year. Honda test driver Christian Klein was also sniffing around for a way back onto the F1 grid after being dropped by Red Bull the previous year, and Honda even released the Austrian from his testing contract to go test with Spyker at Spa. But throughout all the whispering rumours and the hushed allegations, one other name was starting to pop up in conversations: Markus Winkelhock. After all, Markus was Spyker's official reserve driver. It was his literal job to be readily on hand to stand in if either driver was unavailable to race, and with less than 2 weeks to go until the next round, the European Grand Prix, Markus seemed well suited for that role, at the very least for an interim period. Even Collers was quoted as saying, "We are looking into doing Markus a favour." 8 days after the sacking of Albers, Spyker announced Markus would drive for them at the European Grand Prix. And in a weird way, it was the perfect opportunity for Markus to be making his debut. For a start, there was no overriding pressure. Like the bar for a Jamaican limboing at the Olympics, expectations for Markus were pretty low. The Spyker had failed to finish any higher than 13th that year, and only once had it qualified outside the bottom 3 spots on the grid. And while certainly not woefully unprepared for his outing, he was arguably not as sharp as he would have liked to be. Prior to the race, he'd only tested the car twice, once at Silverstone and once at Paul Ricard, and even then approximately 3 months ago. Since then, he'd been more accustomed to the handling and operation of a touring car, which, observers might be surprised to learn, is oh so slightly different from driving an F1 car. Plus, Spyker had informed Markus privately and then to the media that this was very much a one-off race. This wasn't a case of a lack of faith in the German, more an honest touch of realism. Whoever would fill the seat for the remainder of the year would need to bring a large financial package to plug up the hole left by the departure of Albers and his sponsors, which Markus knew he couldn't bring. So it freed Markus to simply enjoy this opportunity, rather than worry about a potential audition for a full-time drive. If there was a positive note that Markus could latch onto, it would be the location of his debut, the Nürburgring, a track he knew well from his years pounding around in his junior career. Indeed, Collis fully admitted that Markus's knowledge of the track was part of the reason he got the drive, as it would be one less hurdle for him to navigate. It would also be an emotional return for the Winkelhock name to F1, for the Nürburgring was the last track his father Manfred had raced at in F1 before he died. If anything, the return of the Winkelhock name to F1 for one final race would neatly close the Winkelhock chapter in the annals of F1 history. After first practice, Markus was last on a 1:37.1, 0.7 seconds adrift of Sutil. To be within a second of his teammate was quite an impressive effort considering his lack of recent single-seater experience. Markus was quick to tell the media how wildly different it was from his recent DTM adventures, saying that the first couple of laps felt like a PlayStation, almost unreal, with the vast increase in downforce he was now having to consider. Second practice, he dipped to 0.2 slower than his previous effort, but keeping the gap to Sutil steady with a 0.8 second deficit. Markus was trying his best to enjoy every single lap and soak in the experience, but already the strain of an F1 car was paying its toll on his body. Winkelhock was telling his mechanics to add some bedding to the side of his headrest in case his neck was completely done, and he was already voicing doubts over his body holding up to a full race distance. After improving to a 1:36.0 in the final practice session, albeit now 1.6 seconds off Sutil's best effort, he headed into qualifying with little expectations, which was good, because Markus, whilst improving to a 1:35.9, remained in plumb last, 1.4 seconds away from his teammate. Post-qualifying, Markus was quick to hold his hands up, admitting that he hadn't quite got to grips with the car and had been over-driving, which went some way to explaining the deficit between himself and Sutil. So what was the goal for the race? Finish the race with no incidents and as close to Sutil as possible, said Markus. A reasonable goal, and it should go without saying, to enjoy and soak in the experience as much as possible. And as it turned out, he would indeed be soaked, and he'd have one hell of an experience. Race day rolled around and there were whisperings in the air that rain might be on the way. Anyone who's taken a glance at an F1 race within the past few seasons and heard mutterings of potential rain knows such a statement needs to be made with the largest pinch of salt, for such weather predictions seem to rely less on any sort of technology, and instead the age-old practice of sticking your hand out and seeing if you can feel any droplets. And sure enough, with 15, 10 and 5 minutes to go before the race starts, the track remained stubbornly bone dry, and the swirling clouds above, whilst grey and looming, had failed to excrete even the tiniest drip. And so everyone set off on their formation lap, warming tyres, checking everything was A-OK with their cars. But then halfway through the formation lap, as he watched the other 21 cars ahead of him, Winkelhock spotted something no one else had. Some drops had fallen on his visor. And now Markus's Nürburgring knowledge was about to pay dividends. Here was a track he'd been racing at for the past decade of his life, in junior series and in sports cars, where he'd watched his father and his uncles all those years ago. He knew its turns, its characteristics. He knew what to expect when he felt raindrops on his visor. As he revealed later, he knew that if there was rain coming from the hairpin where he felt it, and with the skies as dark as they were, that rain was coming, and not just any rain, but heavy rain. Immediately, he got on the radio to the pit wall to relay this information. The team sat on that information. They ruminated, they discussed. Then, as Markus was going into the final corner, Mike Gascoigne came on the radio. Box, box, box. Into the pits dived Markus. The team had rolled the dice. Onto Winkelhock's car went a set of wet tyres. After all, what did Markus and the team have to lose? James Allen on ITV noted that might turn out to be an inspired decision. The race got underway and it looked like the gamble might have backfired. It was still dry and the Ferrari of Kimi Räikkönen accelerated away into the lead. It took all of a handful of corners for that to change. Slowly but surely the rain started coming down. First the Red Bull of David Coulthard speared off at turn 4. Then Sutil and the Williams of Nico Rosberg pirouetted simultaneously a few corners later. There was no doubt now that wet tyres were the way to go, and the vast majority of the field, having tippy-toed through the remainder of the lap, dived into the pits to change over, bar Räikkönen, though not through any choice of his own. As the Ferrari tried to enter the pits, it twitched wide and stumbled across the pit entrance, throwing him back onto the track. His reward, in inverted commas, was another lap on dry tyres in increasingly rainy conditions. Markus, scything through the field on his correct choice of tyres, was 10th as Räikkönen squirmed his way across the line, and as everyone in front of him pitted, he crossed the line in 2nd place. And not only was Markus in 2nd, but he was hunting down a car on entirely the wrong tyres at the absolutely worst time. So to the shock and surprise of all watching, rookie Winkelhock had hunted down the 12-time race winner and future world champion Kimi Räikkönen as they approached the hairpin, and the Finn was unable to do anything to defend himself, could only watch as Winkelhock passed him in the middle of the corner and swept into the lead. And not just any lead, but a comfortable one. Winkelhock, on his debut in the slowest car on the grid, was streaking away at the front. As the order became clearer, Markus's lead at the front was just shy of a minute. It was safe to say the gamble had paid off, because even if the rain began to slow or stop now, the track would remain wet, and thus any weaknesses in the car wouldn't begin to show until the track dried out, rain being the great equaliser of all F1 cars and drivers. Lap 3 started and weather had become so bad that water was flowing around turn 1 and nearby tourists were angling for a gondola to traverse those waters. Somehow most of the front-running cars, yes, including Markus, had slithered their way through, but soon the gravel track was filled with cars. First Jenson Button's Honda, soon followed by Lewis Hamilton and his McLaren, the Toro Rossos of Scott Speed and Tonio Liuzzi, Nico Rosberg, and Adrian Sutil. If there was any doubt that the world was emotionally invested in the Winkelhock story that was unfolding before their eyes, those doubts were washed away when Sutil slid off, and commentator Steve Matcher on the American broadcast groaned, "Please don't let it be Winkelhock." But Winkelhock was safe and sound in the pit lane, having dived in to switch to a set of the deeper grooved extreme wet tyres. So dominant was his lead that he emerged still over 30 seconds clear of second place Felipe Massa. At the same time, Hamilton had managed to get himself hoisted back onto the circuit. A new rookie sensation in town, Winkelhock, subsequently lapped the championship leader as he started his 4th lap and his 3rd in the lead. Naturally, with all the chaos about, a safety car had been called. Before the race, Markus had joked with his good friend and safety car driver Bernd Mailander that if he was leading the race, the two could wave at each other, and now it was actually happening. But of course, not for much longer. Conditions were becoming truly treacherous, and soon there was an abundance of red flags waving all around the circuit. A pause in proceedings until the downpour eased up. Over an hour later, the rain had finally stopped, and drivers were pushed back onto the grid in the same order they had been 1 lap before the race had been red flagged. That meant that Markus Winkelhock in his Spyker would be starting from a de facto pole position at the restart. Previously, all his rivals were up to a minute down the road, and now Markus would have his mirrors full of McLarens and Ferraris. So what to do now? The track was still damp, but now drying. And in drying conditions, Winkelhock and Spyker knew they had as much chance as keeping the chasing pack behind as a sales attendant does at a Black Friday sale. So there was only one thing to do: roll that dice once more. They went for a set of the full wet tyres in direct opposition to the intermediate tyres that the remainder of the field had chosen. Because maybe, just maybe, today would be the day that the racing gods would look down at the Nürburgring and say, "Yeah, go on then, let's have another chapter to this underdog tale," and throw down another storm. But it wasn't to be. Maybe Spyker's radar was wrong, or perhaps their rain dance hadn't included enough jazz hands, because the additional rain never came. After running behind the safety car for 3 laps, the safety car pulled in and the race began once more, and tumbling down the order went Winkelhock. First Massa dove past as they headed into turn 1, before Alonso had also swept around Markus by the next corner. Then it was the Red Bulls of Coulthard and Webber, followed swiftly by Heikki Kovalainen's Renault. Not long after that came Raikkonen just before the corner where, a few laps beforehand, Winkelhock had swept past him. The Williams of Alex Wurz was the next to dispatch the Spyker, and after 1 lap, Markus had dropped from 1st to 8th. Another lap passed, and now the Spyker was down to 14th. By the end of the lap after that, Winkelhock was 16th, next to last, with only the lapped Hamilton behind him. And within another 3 laps, a hydraulic failure pulled him over to the side of the road and out of the race. But if Markus or the team were disappointed, they didn't show it. Winkelhock recalled years later how, after he retired, he hopped out of the car and behind the guardrail to immediately sign autographs for the crowd. And upon returning to the pit, how the whole team was smiling and laughing about the whole experience. Fernando Alonso would go on to win the race that day, after a minor bit of argy-bargy with Massa on lap 56 to take the lead, which preceded the teeniest of squabbles between the two afterwards. But whilst the eyes of the world feasted upon another delicious piece of post-race drama, it was easy to already forget the scenes we'd witnessed right back at the beginning of the race. Later that year, Gascoigne would recount how the greatest story for him that year wasn't the moment Markus took the lead of the race, but after the race, when he and Markus sat down with a few other engineers whilst the race highlights were playing, and when they showed the clip of him overtaking Raikkonen for the lead, a strange expression went over Markus before he smiled broadly and said, "That's me, I'm leading." Such was the adrenaline of the moment, it wasn't until afterwards that it all sunk in for the German. His 6 laps in the lead would mean he'd led the 6th most laps that year, ahead of the likes of BMW Sauber duo Nick Heidfeld and Kubica, and Renault Giancarlo Fisichella. and due to the red flag and restart, Winkelhock remains the only driver to have started both last and first at the same Grand Prix. On the 26th of July, just 8 days after the race, Spyker announced their second driver for the remainder of the season. But it wasn't Markus Winkelhock. No, the team instead had plumped for Sakon Yamamoto, who'd started 7 Grand Prix for Super Aguri the previous year. And whilst the team elected the use of the excuse of his experience at the upcoming circuits and reputation as a promising young Japanese driver, a quote that had the masses begging like Gordon Ramsay trying a dry chicken for some sort of sauce, there was little doubt it was Sakon's healthy backing that had brought him into the Spyker fold. And whilst a new B-spec Spyker was introduced at the Belgian Grand Prix, where it flew in the hands of Sutil, vaulting up to 14th from 19th at the start and hounding the Red Bulls throughout the race, as well as grabbing the final point at Asogi, Japan, Yamamoto's performances were hardly better than Alba's. Outqualified by Sutil 7-0, and only beating the German to the checkered flag on the occasions that Adrian had retired, with a best result of 12th out of 13 in the aforementioned downpour of Japan and a lap behind his teammate. Aside from that, he was last at every race, and needless to say, did not lead a single lap. The F1 door had swung shut for Markus, but Collers wouldn't quickly forget his Grand Prix exploits. There was still a seat at Collers' DTM operation open for the remainder of the year, and Collers wasted no time in signing Markus up for that seat. 3 years in the DTM followed, taking a handful of points finishes and peaking with 10th overall in 2009. From 2011, it was on to the world of GT racing for Markus, where he's found most of his success. GT1 World Champion in 2012, and then Champion in the Pro-Am GT class in 2018. Not to mention success at iconic venues, twice a winner of the Spa 24 Hours, and thrice a winner at, where else, the Nürburgring 24 Hours. So, how do we rate the exploits of one Markus Winkelhock on that Sunday afternoon all those years ago? Was it simply a matter of luck, of being in the right place at the right time? How much of that performance can we credit to skill? If we're being blunt, of course a large part of this story comes from being on the right tyres at the right time. If the rain is coming down and you're the first and only person running wet tyres on your car, naturally you're going to be the fastest on track and you'll be more than happy to reap the rewards. But it was a gamble that Markus had a big part in. If Spyker wanted to gamble on the rumoured rain, they could have started him on some wet tyres on the grid. But it was Markus with his local knowledge who recognised the signs of the forthcoming rain, who radioed the team and who kick-started that whole strategic shuffle. No one else noticed those signs. And being in that position and remaining in that position are two different prospects entirely. It's one thing for a driver to find themselves in such an optimal position. It's another to take full advantage of that position and crucially to not mess it up. F1 history is littered with drivers who've thrown away golden opportunities or gone all in on a gamble and lost big time. On one hand, as stated previously, this was a relatively pressure-free opportunity for Markus at the Nürburgring that weekend. But on the other, that all turned on its head the moment Markus found himself comfortably leading on his debut. Can you imagine what was going on in his mind? The pressure to keep going, to not make a mistake, how if the rain kept up, this could be an incredible opportunity to pick up some points, to stand on the podium, maybe even win the race. And crucially in that moment, Markus didn't crack. At no point did he drift off circuit or nudge a barrier, which was doubly impressive when you consider how he'd never even driven an F1 car in the wet before this day. Perhaps the only error that day might have been the decision to stay on full wets at the restart, but really, there was nothing to lose at that point, and the only thing that would have changed how they followed the strategic calls of those around them would have been the rate at which he fell back through the pack. Some people might bemoan the fact that Markus wasn't given the Spyker seat for the remainder of the year after those heroics in the rain, but I would disagree. If anything, I'm glad, because that little moment of glory for Winkelhock gets to live in its own little bubble of history. You think of Markus Winkelhock and you think of that race. Any further outings would have most likely been somewhat anonymous, as demonstrated by replacement Yamamoto, would have taken the shine off the Winkelhock story. Instead, we get to remember a wonderfully wet and wild afternoon in 2007 when a rookie in his one and only race, through his own skills, placed the name Winkelhock back on top of the world for a few glorious and memorable laps. And he'd like to think Manfred would have loved to have seen it. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider pulling into the pitbox of my channel, bolting on the tyres of hitting that subscribe button, and tearing off the fresh visor of hitting the like button. I've had word from the pit wall that it's the best strategy available for you.